Chapter 32, Trojan. August 6th, 2086. The Cathedral of Jericho, Altair Star System. A person standing in the ruins of the old progenitor city could have looked up at the sky and been convinced the world was about to end. Hundreds of brilliant fireballs streaked through the heavens, all traveling in the same direction. On a nearby hilltop, a large number of progeny soldiers were gathered. They turned their backs to the armada of starships passing through the atmosphere and listened while their leaders gave orders. An acolyte and a sorceress raised their arms in salute one last time as the soldiers under their command turned and began walking away. About 50 troops, men and women, vanished into the ruins of the abandoned city. As soon as their subordinates were gone, the acolyte and sorceress turned to face one another, their faces grim. They gave one another a nod, and then the sorceress turned away. She faced the gleaming silver building in the distance. Even from this far away, it was possible to see many people standing outside the Cathedral of Jericho. Moving with great reluctance, the acolyte withdrew from his belt a Gauss pistol. He raised the weapon, and after taking a moment to steel his nerves, he shot the sorceress in the back, killing her. Then, with shaking hands, the acolyte turned the weapon upon himself. Dozens of warships of the Galactic Defense Force landed within a mile of the cathedral. GDF soldiers disembarked, armed and ready for the final battle, but such preparations were unnecessary. The progeny did not so much collapse as it melted away. The militant arm of the cult of Jericho was simply incapable of fighting anymore. As the GDF approached their positions, what few cultists remained simply held their fire. Most progeny fighters laid their weapons on the ground and allowed the invaders to pass, waiting patiently to be captured. Each fighter taken into custody was in horrible shape. The last remaining progeny fighters were emaciated from lack of food. Most of their weapons did not function, and none of them wore armor. Instead, the fighters dressed in ragged clothes that might have been uniforms a long time ago. Furthermore, nearly all of these fighters were either very old men or teenagers. No military-aged men remained. A few members of the progeny fled into the ruined city, perhaps out of panic or desperation. Those who remained did not resist capture. As the first prisoners were processed, the truth came out. Somehow, both the cult and the progeny had learned the truth about the death of Erin Hyatt, including the identity of her killer. As soon as it was known that the cult made an enemy of the woman they worshipped, things fell apart. Outside the cathedral itself, nearly 400 progeny fighters were trying to make their intention to surrender obvious. They smashed their weapons on rocks, pieces of rubble, or the walls of the cathedral itself. A pile of broken or damaged rifles was growing like a small mountain in the center of the group. As soon as the GDF soldiers came into view, a group of acolytes and sorceresses broke off from the group and walked out to meet them. No words were spoken. Instead, one of the sorceresses raised her arm and dropped her rifle to the ground in an unmistakable gesture of capitulation. The GDF field commander ordered his troops to capture all of the cultists alive. As soon as the GDF stepped into the grounds of the cathedral, a series of dull thuds could be heard inside of the building, followed by an ominous silence. A team of Partogan Green Guards, augmented by Vagar Crusaders and Mycor battle droids, stacked up against the ornate golden doors and then breached the cathedral. Inside, they found 14 acolytes and one sorceress who had chosen death over surrender. They also found nearly 500 alien children, terrified and miserable, but nonetheless alive. Little Higarans, Partogans, Cybon, Tidani, Vanians, Ashurians, Vagar, Amadi, and Kelt scrambled out of the darkened cathedral and back into the light, daring to hope that their long ordeal was finally over. August 11th, 2086. Gehenna asteroid field. Vagar reaches. Speeding through dense clouds of dust and ice, the spaceplane Niagara entered a region of space known as Gehenna. This place was a very dense asteroid field, illuminated by shafts of yellow light from a nearby star. On board, the Stormbreakers and their passenger were preparing for a very important excursion. Maui used the targeting computer to scan each asteroid, searching for a very specific landmark. Meanwhile, Kingi was digging through his personal possessions in the back, searching for something. And Setla was sitting next to the space heater in the fuselage, keeping his reptilian body warm while he spoke to Jericho. "So let me see if I've got this straight," Jericho was saying. "You are the second generation of Stormbreakers, charged with hunting down Akira, and you've never met your employer, who seems to have endless resources at his disposal?" "Never," Setla shook his head. "Nor has he explained why we were chosen in particular. Only two of us have an axe to grind with the paradox, namely Varian and Kingi." Setla pointed a scaled thumb at the Ashurian-Partogan hybrid as he re-emerged from the crew quarters. Kingi was looking very frustrated, having failed to find whatever he was searching for. "What is your quarrel with Akira?" Jericho asked. Kingi narrowed his eyes for a moment, then relaxed under Jericho's quizzical gaze. He began to explain. "Years ago, I was friends with a man named Mido Mihaka. He was a space explorer, and he often allowed me to share in his discoveries. I believed he would be the man to chart all of the Great Wastelands, and I supported his work toward that goal. One day he came to me and said he was leading a Levakian starship, the Mami Tamihana, into the Sea of Lost Souls on a very special expedition. He was sworn to secrecy until it was finished, but promised to tell all when it was over. I went to Araki, eagerly awaiting his return. I wasn't worried about his safety, though. The two of us had befriended several members of the Commonwealth military, and a few of our comrades were traveling with Mido aboard the Tamihana. There was Iruni, who was something of a class clown, Kodan, who was on the fast track to becoming captain of his own ship someday, and the Hippongo brothers, Taiki and Tuli. Your day was not complete until they taught you something new. I knew they would make an incredible team, and I kept an eye out on the news for them every day. Eventually, there was. On every television and radio and hyperwave, it was announced that Mido had visited the grave world of Partoga and recovered the body of the legendary queen Vetu Kealoa. Kingi sat down across from Jericho, his expression forlorn. I gathered all of the friends we shared between us and arranged for a party in Mahurangi City. Mido would have come home to a celebration like no other. He would have. Jericho's face fell. She knew this part of the story. The Mami Tamihana was ambushed by an unknown starship. All aboard were killed, and the corpse of Vetu Kealoa was stolen. Kingi choked up, and Jericho stood. She gently placed one hand on his shoulder. Setla's eyes widened in awe. There was no physical change to Kingi's appearance. He just suddenly seemed less gloomy. It was as though some inner light, deep within Kingi, was reignited. I suspected the paradox was somehow responsible, Kingi continued, his voice a little stronger. So I contacted the Emerald Institute, looked through the records of her destructive rampage through our timeline. The more I studied, the more convinced I became. 3 years ago, I traveled to Higara and swore an oath to the dark god Quarjet that I would find Akira and carve her heart from her body. Jericho softly rubbed Kingi's shoulders. Take it from me, Akira is very hard to kill, she said. I thought I witnessed her death 3 times, and each time was proven wrong by the paradox herself. Up in the cockpit, Maui and Varian found what they were looking for. Dig Site 603 was carved into the side of a very large asteroid, surrounded by derelict hulks and shipwrecks. A little less than 100 years ago, the Higarans and Vagar fought a battle in this place, each trying to seize control of the Oracle, a relic left behind by the old progenitor empire. The shattered hulks of frigates and destroyers drifted around the area, while a faint ring made of tiny bits of wire and metal orbited the asteroid itself. A few modern starships could be seen docked to the dig site on the surface, and as the Niagara drew closer, Varian could observe that all of them belonged to the Galactic Defense Force, with one exception. A single human warship could be found docked between 2 Partogan cruisers. The Achilles-class corvette was painted with the colors and symbols of the Hawaiian Republic. I'll bet that's our mysterious employer, Varian said. Is everyone ready to meet the Shadow Man face to face? Once the Archangel landed on asteroid 603, Jericho and the Stormbreakers rode an industrial elevator down to the dig site, a pressurized chamber over a kilometer below the surface. Due to the asteroid's small size, the force of gravity here was incredibly weak. Jericho seemed to be standing a little straighter here than she did on Earth. The actual dig site chamber was a fascinating place. There were 4 metal walls and a ceiling from which the lights were hung, but the cave floor remained exposed, and century-old mining equipment was strewn all around, along with a few weapons left behind by the Higaran raiders. A hole in the dirt occupied a space near the center of the cavern, marking the spot where the Oracle was found a century ago. Protective railing ran all the way around this hole, and it was here that the meeting would take place. A group of people were already present in the dig site, and the Stormbreakers felt their collective heartbeats skip when they recognized just who these people were. Marka Ranginui, Galactic Custodian and Queen of the Partogan Lavakian Commonwealth, was hard to recognize as she had a thick scarf wrapped around her neck. General McCavity of the Galactic Defense Force prowled the edges of the room, agitated. A huge reptilian alien, shaped vaguely like the mythical European dragons of Earth, was watching Queen Marka with an expression of concern. This was her loyal advisor. The director of the Emerald Institute was here as well. In the semi-darkness of this cavern, the old Tidani man looked even more like a monster than usual. There was also half a dozen generals and admirals from some of the most powerful member states of the Galactic Council. 2 Partogans, a Vagar, a Tidan, a Blorg, and 1 Cybon. But Varian only had eyes for 2 people in the middle of the group. Leaning against the railing and shaking hands with the surrounding military leaders were 2 humans. An elderly man who carried himself like a renowned veteran, and an elderly woman who rested all of her weight on the ornate golden handle of a beautiful cane. Quarter, Kingi, Setla, Nainu, and Maui did not recognize this old couple, but as soon as Varian cried out, they put 2 and 2 together. "Grandpa! Grandma! What the hell are you doing here?" The elderly couple turned to look at Varian, and their faces seemed to light up as though the joy had suddenly returned to their lives. The old woman, too hobbled and hunched over to walk properly, took a couple of tottering steps forward before Varian reached her, and they embraced in a tight hug. "Well, I say, you look like my grandchild," the woman cried. "But it can't be. She's too busy saving the galaxy." "Oh, Bachan, knock it off," Varian gasped. You're embarrassing me in front of my friends! The old woman hugged Varian so tightly that she, or he, could only make a squeaking sound. Then she narrowed her eyes and addressed the 5 remaining Stormbreakers. So you're the other 5, huh? I do hope you've been treating my little Vicky right. I keep this around, just for her. And, to the shock of everyone present, the old lady reached her free hand into her handbag and withdrew an ancient-looking pistol. The spindly hammer next to the iron sight made the weapon appear like a primitive flintlock. The 4 Stormbreakers stepped back, but Quarter stood fast, as she was looking at the weapon with an impressed look on her face. "Oh, wow," Quarter said. "That's the Shadow Keeper! Blake Robinson used it to break the Time Core at the War in Heaven 50 years ago. Which means you must be..." Quarter looked into the old woman's face. Age had not been kind to her, but a kind of fire could be seen burning in her deep blue eyes. "Tachibana Chihiro," the old woman said. "Count yourself lucky that my grandchild thinks so highly of you." Varian, looking very embarrassed, pressed on their grandmother's arm, forcing the primitive firearm back into the handbag. "Okay, Oba-chan, that's enough," Varian hissed. "We're good. You can calm down now." The 5 remaining Stormbreakers were struck dumb. Of course, they all knew that Varian was related to 2 of the original Stormbreakers, yet they never dreamed that one day they would come face to face with Chihiro Tachibana and her husband, Blake Robinson, the heroes of Hiroshima who led XCOM to victory alongside Jericho in the battle for Earth. Blake was normally a stoic and calm person, but when he saw Varian, a great smile dawned on his features. Varian hesitated when Chihiro released him, or her, but let out a squeak when Blake swept up his grandchild in a bone-crushing hug. "Varian, you've done well," Blake declared. "Your mother was right. You really can take care of yourself." Varian was too overwhelmed to speak, because Blake was holding them with one hand and using the other to tousle their hair. Finally, she, or he, managed to choke out, "How did you know to come here? How did you know where we were?" Setla was the first to pick up on the truth. He quickly looked from Varian to Blake and back again. After a few moments of complete disbelief, he said, "It was you! You are the man, the one from Jericho Station!" "No way," Quarter said. "No effing way!" "Wait, they named a space station after me?" Jericho said. Blake looked over at Varian's head and shot a meaningful glance at Queen Marka, who returned the expression. This seemed to confirm Setla's accusation. Maui quickly placed his smart glasses onto his face and scanned Blake. The images of Blake and the Shadow Man were faintly visible in the lenses. "This is the best match I've had so far," Maui said. "And according to my database, Blake's financial status would theoretically permit him to be our paymaster." "Not entirely his own finances," a voice cut in. The director of the Emerald Institute raised his hand. The Institute collaborated with Captain Robinson on his clandestine endeavor. Before the outbreak of war made such transactions impossible, we contributed to Robinson's work with liquid assets. Currency from every spacefaring civilization was provided to him, along with access to intelligence from the Sentry Array. "I wasn't the only person trying to fight the paradox," Blake said. "Plenty of folks out there were convinced she was still alive. I just needed to find them. And speaking of people who fight the paradox, you failed to introduce us to your extra companion. Varian, please." Throughout this whole reunion, Jericho had awkwardly stood back. While she was also old, she was still 20 years younger than Blake and Chihiro. Compared to her 2 fellow heroes, Jericho was just barely starting her own physical decline. At Blake's insistence, Jericho stepped into the light. Unlike Chihiro, Jericho had aged gracefully, retaining some of her beauty, now accentuated with grace and a kindly smile. The gathered leaders regarded Jericho curiously, while Blake and Chihiro embraced her. "It really is you!" Chihiro sounded gleeful. "What happened? Where did you go?" "You know me," Jericho replied, speaking into Chihiro's shoulder. "I ran away from my own failures, and it took a Robinson to help me come back to my senses, just like last time." This answer satisfied the Robinson family, and a look of dawning comprehension came over the rest of the GDF leaders. One by one, each general and admiral realized the truth. A Vaegar fell to his knees and started praying out loud. Jericho saw this and took a step back. No, please," Jericho mumbled. "Glorious Sajukar," the Vaegar said. "On behalf of the Vaegar Crusades, I beg for your favor." Fortunately, Setla and Kingi realized Jericho was uncomfortable. They gently lifted the Vaegar back to his feet and carried him a short distance away. Queen Marka stuttered for a moment, unsure of how to properly address Jericho. Great One? There's something I don't understand. That is to say, many people throughout the galaxy, we all thought you were dead. When the Trinity exploded during the War in Heaven, we thought no one could survive that." "Akira did," Jericho replied coldly. There was silence for a moment. Then Blake spoke up. "There were several ways to get off the Trinity," he said. "There were fighters and corvettes in most of the hangar bays. Akira almost certainly flew back to Earth in one of them." The Saibon general pointed at Jericho. "But how did you get away?" he asked. Jericho took a deep breath. "I used a Cygate." Again, a moment of silence. Then the Blorg admiral said, "Bullshit." Everyone chuckled. Even Jericho let out a girlish giggle. "It really sounds like that, huh?" she said. "After all I did to destroy the gift, something I hated so much, I just walked out through a Cygate. Well," Jericho sighed, then went on. "I really tried to destroy psionics," she said. "I hate the gift, and it only leads to bad things. But I truly did not understand where the gift comes from. I destroyed all psionic energy in the galaxy, but I failed to stop new energy from being created. Any sentient life form can generate small amounts of psionic energy in their brains, and I can't stop that process, no matter how I try." Jericho hung her head. Chihiro finished the explanation. "My friend here has an ability to siphon those trace amounts of psionic energy we generate in our brains," Chihiro said. "So when she tried to destroy the gift, her powers regenerated almost instantly." "I walked through the Cygate without really thinking about it," Jericho confessed. "I ended up in the ruins of an Advent base somewhere in Vietnam. I looked up and saw the Trinity explode. The rest, well..." She trailed off, looking nervously at the assembled leaders. After a moment of silence, General McCavity said, "Mighty Beast Slayer, we are in awe of your power and glory. What is your first command?" For the first time, Jericho's expression darkened. "All due respect," she said in a small voice. "I'm no tactician or strategist. If anything, I should be asking what your intentions are, not the other way around." The Blorg objected. His slimy, fungoid body seemed to jiggle as he spoke. "If you truly are the girl who became a god, then we would be quite out of line to propose any course of action that contravenes your own." Jericho looked around the room. She took issue with both halves of the Admiral's statement. Just like 50 years ago, Jericho rejected out of hand the attempts other people made to treat her as some divine being. Nor would she dictate commandments to those who professed themselves her followers. She was a tired old woman, not a god. But there was another problem. The Blorg had used the word if. Looking around the room, Jericho telepathically probed everyone. Some of the more sensitive individuals, such as the advisor and Nainu, could sense the intrusion and became uncomfortable. Nainu, knowing what was coming next, stepped closer to Jericho and grabbed the skirt of her dress, since he was too short to reach her hand. "Some of you doubt me," Jericho said. "That's okay. I'm not the same wide-eyed teenager who sent Agamemnon packing all those decades ago. So just tell me, is there something I can say or do to convince you that I really am, well, myself?" Nainu reacted before anyone could speak. "Jericho is Jericho! She should not have to prove herself to anyone!" To her surprise, the Vagar Admiral, Quarter, the Cybon General, Setla, Kingi, and the Institute Director all spoke up in Jericho's defense, arguing that her mere presence was sufficient evidence of her claim. The Vagar went even further, claiming Jericho was trying to test everyone's faith. "And many of you are failing," the Vagar concluded. Just when it seemed like this confrontation would descend into an argument, Queen Marka threw out a hand. Silence fell immediately. "In the royal palace on Araki," Marka said, "there is a small library containing the personal diaries of Nomsa, who was our queen during the final days of the Second Hyperspace War. In those pages, Nomsa said she met you, and that you were a master of psionics unlike any who came before. Prove your mastery to us, and our curiosities will be satisfied." Jericho gave Nainu a reassuring pat on the head, then replied, "Of course. How would you like me to do that?" Queen Marka reached up to her neck and began to undo the thick scarf she wore. As the scarf fell away, everybody gasped, except for the Queen's advisor. Marka's lower neck was horrifically mutilated. Several deep gashes were sewn together with medical sutures, and the gruesome scars left behind were very unpleasant to look at. "2 months ago, I was the victim of an assassination attempt," Marka said. "The true story of that day was hidden away, and the galaxy at large was told this cover story. My cousin suddenly died, and I was so stricken with grief that I fell ill. Absolutely no one in this room knows the truth. If you really are who these people claim you to be, you will look into my eyes, my mind and soul, then tell us the true story of what happened the night my cousin died." Maui in particular was hit hard by this revelation. Someone had tried to kill his queen. Seething, Maui looked around at his comrades. His mind was awash with fantasies about how he would fight the would-be assassin should they ever cross paths. Quarter wrapped her tail around him and started to purr, imploring Maui to calm down. Her face passive, Jericho stepped forward and took Queen Marka's hand in her own. Jericho looked into Marka's eyes, while everyone else looked on in awe and wonder. Jericho began to speak. "On the day you became queen, you appointed Tamaho Renji Nui, your cousin, to be your Kuhina Nui. You and he were very close. You may as well have been siblings. Together, you ruled the Commonwealth for many years. But then, you noticed something change. Tamaho became distant and silent. Despite sharing so much of his time with you, he never seemed to give the same energy to your shared activities as he once did. Tamaho was going through the motions. Then came that fateful night in June. You may have suppressed the memories, buried the trauma, but they are still here. Tamaho invited you to a private dinner in the palace. You were excited and eager to reconnect with a loved one. The two of you drank Madu Kabolo and laughed about times long past. Then Tamaho stood and offered to bring you another glass. He walked to the serving table behind you. Jericho and Marka both closed their eyes. Nainu, Varian, and all of the others were leaning in close, hanging into her every word. It was an ambush, Jericho continued. Tamaho returned and grabbed you by the hair with one hand and drew a blade across your neck with the other. But Tamaho Ranginui was a politician, not a killer. He did not know how to strike someone in a way that causes death instead of injury. His mistake was your salvation. You began to struggle, and your neck was slashed twice more. You kicked the table and escaped from Tamaho's grip. There was a fight. To save your own life, you employed the skills and knowledge your cousin lacked. You disarmed Tamaho and then killed him with the same blade that would have taken your own life. Palace staff entered the room, and you passed out in their arms. Jericho let go of Queen Marka and stepped back. Struggling to hide her emotions, Marka busied herself with returning her scarf to its rightful position around her neck and shoulders. All around, people were overwhelmed by the story Jericho told. After a moment, Maui said, "Why, though? Kuhina Nui Rangi Nui? Why?" "I can answer that," said Blake. "Your Majesty, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your Kuhina Nui was under ISO control for the last 3 years. Blake reached into his pocket and produced a small tablet computer. While everyone watched, Blake sorted through the file manager and found an audio recording. This was captured by a listening device in Scarlett Freeman's office about 9 months ago, Blake said. Then he played the recording. The voice of ISO Director Scarlett Freeman emanated from the tablet for all to hear. "I stayed up late waiting for our agents on Auraki to check in," Scarlett's voice said. "Any problems?" replied the voice of Inez Espinosa. "Not this time," Scarlett's voice answered. "I've got a man so close to Queen Marka that I can have her throat slit whenever I want. She doesn't even know she's been outplayed. What about you? Do you have the test results?" Blake stopped the recording. "I have my own infiltrators inside of the ISO," Blake said. "We suspected the man Freeman referred to was Kuhina Nui Rangi Nui, but we never had enough evidence to act. I'm sorry we failed to warn you in time." Marka waved her hand and shook her head. "Consider yourself forgiven," she said. "I was so attached to Tamaho that I might not have believed you anyway." The atmosphere in the dusty cavern was warmer now, metaphorically. Everyone seemed willing to listen and cooperate with each other. Varian, eager to convert this good feeling into action, tried to get the ball rolling. "Grandpa, you said you arranged this meeting, but why? Shouldn't you be back on Earth? You know, running for Secretary General to get rid of Etienne?" Varian asked. All eyes were on Blake now. Queen Marka's voice seemed to shift, suggesting she was now speaking from her role as Galactic Custodian. "I'm risking not just my political future by meeting an enemy politician in secret. The fate of my Commonwealth is on the line too, as well as the institution of the Galactic Custodian. This had better be worth the risk, Robinson." Blake nodded. "You have all taken great risks to meet with me, and I am grateful," he said. "I've come to deliver a warning in the hopes that you will be able to exploit it to your advantage." "A warning?" repeated the advisor. "Is the human armada going to leave Alpha Centauri?" "Yes, But that's only part of the message, Blake said. The subjugation of Amadeo is causing a political firestorm on Earth. Thanks to Freeman's psionic weapon, there are now about 5 billion brainwashed sentients who are desperate to make themselves into humanity's slaves as quickly as possible. Their planet is ravaged from the past year and a half of fighting, and Amadeo's current food output is insufficient to keep the native population alive, let alone an occupying army of 2 million humans. Several generals and admirals gave each other nervous looks. Of course, the advisor said. Unless Amadeo receives shipments of food from somewhere else in the galaxy, the UN army will starve and be forced to steal food from the Amadi locals. And it's all downhill from here, Blake said. He gestured to his wife, who carried on. Etienne's government will be forced to break the strict information quarantine placed on all human territories, Chihiro said. Ever since the war started, he has claimed the galaxy is being affected by a space storm. Etienne uses this imaginary storm to justify cutting off hyperlines and banning travel from one planet to another. He's kept the population under control this way, but sending large-scale aid to Amadeo will force Etienne to abandon his space storm narrative. Humanity's freedom of interstellar movement will be restored. Marca's advisor looked like he had a dozen ideas running in his head all at once. The dragon-like alien began to pace. Large-scale movement of civilians will facilitate the movement of information, the advisor said. The human populace will quickly grow to learn and understand the true extent of their government's lies. It's worse, Blake added. Even though my people just scored a major victory over you, morale is very low. People are aware of our growing isolation from the galactic community, and a small minority are, at some level, aware of the wider war being waged against the galaxy. Our soldiers and crewmen don't know what they're fighting for, and many are starting to figure out that our invasion of Amadeo was no peacekeeping mission. The truth is very slowly dawning on Earth and our colonies. The advisor's brow furrowed. He was putting the puzzle together in his mind and was starting to understand. All of this, mere months before Secretary General Etienne would stand for re-election, he said. The advisor turned to look at Blake. Very slowly, a realization began to spread around the room. A wicked grin appeared on Chihiro's face. To use a human expression, Chihiro said, my husband and I have placed Pascal Etienne in checkmate. The Secretary General is trapped in a vice. He simply does not know it yet. Marca, her advisor, McCavity, and several of the military leaders grew very excited. You have enough support to overthrow Etienne? General McCavity said. Excellent! When is the coup d'etat? I hate to disappoint you, Blake replied with a half-hearted laugh. My allies on Earth have agreed to carry out a different plan. We are going to execute a non-violent revolution. It will most likely happen sometime within the next 4 or 5 weeks. This caused excited chatter to fill the room. GDF leaders, in hushed whispers only, dared to use the phrase, "end of the war." Blake raised a hand and went on. My political allies are in position within several member states of the UNE. When the time comes, several heads of government who belong to Etienne's faction will be removed from power in rapid succession. One such leader has already been removed in the United Kingdom. Once that's done, we'll flip the Security Council and vote Etienne out of office. The Stormbreakers were impressed by Blake's machinations. It was good to know their boss had not been idle this whole time. The advisor asked, "When is the soonest you would be able to strike?" Blake took a deep breath. "Right now," he said. "Wait, I don't understand," Corder commented. Varian stepped forward. "Grandpa just said he's already replaced the leader of the UK with an ally, right?" he or she said. Blake nodded, and Varian went on. "The United Kingdom has veto power on the Security Council. Don't you see?" That's it! Etienne's done! He cannot be re-elected because there's a veto waiting for him. It's really checkmate. But, Blake said, removing Etienne alone is not enough. His supporters, scattered throughout human society, need to be neutralized as well. That's why the revolution plan. That's why I need both you, Galactic Custodian, and you, Jericho, and you and your team, Varian. Marka, Varian, and Jericho looked nervously at one another, and then back to Blake. I need a spectacle, Blake explained. Something that will turn the human race against Etienne in one fell swoop. I need you to give the UN military the most humiliating defeat possible. Chihiro stepped forward. The UN Navy is massing in Alpha Centauri right now, she said. But our spy in the Reichstag says Etienne and Admiral Siajotso have been arguing about what to do with the fleet. Siajotso doesn't want to go on the offensive when a food shortage is imminent. She's planning to scatter the fleet and have them assume defensive positions over human planets. Blake and Chihiro looked at one another, then addressed Marka. Your Majesty, just imagine how bad Etienne would look if his fleet were forced to scatter instead of doing it under their own power. He would be toppled from within by his own people, and the GDF will be spared a costly battle on Earth itself, Chihiro said. That's what we want from you and Jericho and the Stormbreakers. Go to Alpha Centauri, engage the UN Navy, and put them to flight. Once the Navy is scattered, Blake concluded, I'll take care of the rest.